Bare-knuckled faith. Yeah. Welcoming home the disowned self and recovering from a bipolar world and religion. This is episode 2, The Shadow. This is part 2 of a 3-part series aimed at reimagining the alchemy of good and evil. I've been pondering, praying, and writing about melding good and evil, right and wrong, hope and hopelessness into a different kind of an alloy, one to strengthen the embodied soul rather than to thrash it. By way of introduction, I will borrow from that internet sensation that is called The Story of the Two Wolves. Now, there is no determining where this thing came from. I've tried. And I have read it credited to the Cherokee Nation, other indigenous peoples, and even Billy Graham. Yeah, I didn't see that coming either. So, I wouldn't invest too much credibility in a mystical or shamanistic origin for this story, but it's a good metaphor, that's all. Anyway, if you haven't heard it, there are 2 versions that I've discovered, a longer and a shorter one, and I'm gonna give just the bare bones version without all the romanticized rhetoric. It's a tale about a grandfather imparting wisdom to his grandson. He tells the boy about this terrible internal struggle that he has between, that he's been enduring, a kind of a civil war of the soul within him that's represented by 2 wolves. One, a silver wolf, is full of anger, envy, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, shame, resentment, and haughtiness. The other, a dark wolf, is full of joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, compassion, truth, and kindness. Now, in the short version of this story, the grandson asks his grandfather which wolf will win the battle for his soul. Whichever one I feed, says the old man. But in the longer, somewhat less popular version of this story, the grandfather replies, if you feed both wolves, then both of them will prosper. He goes on to tell the boy that the silver wolf has many good traits and that even the harsher qualities have their own kind of healing powers. Likewise, the old man tells his grandson, the dark wolf has a host of weaknesses and vulnerabilities that lie within what otherwise seem like positive characteristics. Both wolves are valuable parts of the old man, and obviously us. And more to the point, both wolves are very much a part of who he is. So feeding them both and utilizing each one's native powers for the benefit of all, well, that'll make the old man stronger and heal the divisions within his soul. That's where we're heading towards with this series. If you go with me, then be ready to shake loose some of your faith ponies, those theological assumptions you've been riding around on since childhood. Let's start. Episode 2, The Shadow. Now, the shadow, as Carl Jung called it, or I think a pinch more apt, the disowned self. The disowned self. This is a quote from the course description of a seminar I participated in called Facing the Shadow, an Exploration of Personal Healing and Collective Responsibility. It was offered by the Episcopal Divinity School. It reads, each of us carries a hidden side, what Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung called the shadow. These are the parts of ourselves we've learned to hide, our anger, fear, shame, and unspoken desires. These unacknowledged parts of ourselves show up in how we treat ourselves and how we treat others. They also lurk within the systems of violence that pervade our world. End of quote. I like the description of our shadow as the disowned parts of ourselves. Because I don't know if you're like me, you may not be able to put your finger on every piece that has been disowned from our childhood on, but you know immediately it's a big basket holding lots of stuff. Now, I'm not a psychologist or any kind of sophisticated social scientist of any kind. So take my descriptions with a grain of salt and do your own reading and your own work, your own therapy and spiritual direction. So I think of the ego as the part of ourselves which is self-conscious and aware of the world around it. In addition, the ego has an awareness of some of the internal parts and conversations going on as well. It sees and it recognizes and even sometimes names who we are and what we are. The ego watches itself in the mirror or its reflection in the window, and if it doesn't like what it sees, it may well do something to change its own perception, or also to influence what it imagines is the perception that others have of it. But there's also a part of us that the ego is not conscious of and has even been hidden from the ego, and sometimes hidden by the ego itself. Some citizens of the shadow were placed in hiding by the ego and then abandoned there. This behind the curtain self is what Jung referred to as the shadow. We each have one, and collectively we share one or more also, as I discussed in episode 1. All this is pretty straightforward stuff. I assume that only the most unconscious of people would deny that there is in fact an unconscious or disowned part of themselves. But what might be more intriguing, even more disconcerting, is the idea that neither the ego nor the shadow is all good or all bad. I no longer know what is true, what truly is, and what is not. And my guess, because you're listening to this, is that you don't either, or at least in quiet moments when you feel centered enough to acknowledge it, you know that what you know is very small. This existential agnosticism I'm talking about is not Trump's fault. In fact, Trump gets demonized inappropriately, not unfairly, because whatever the ugliness of his character is, he sheds plenty of that evil with his rhetoric and actions. But he's not some accident of history. He is us, the personification of American evil that we all are a part of sustaining. We deny this at our own peril. And in fact, as I said in episode 1, we are where we are because we have refused to own all those disowned parts of ourselves. But I think we also need to give ourselves a little grace on this. And here's what I mean. We have an analog culture in a digitalized world. This sense of not knowing anything anymore, of being woefully uncertain, is because many of us are children of an analog culture, but we're living in a digitalized world. You see, now most of us baby boomers were raised by parents who had been raised by Victorian era parents. Not only that, they were raised in the aftermath of World War I, then traumatized by the Great Depression, not to mention World War II. So baby boomers were raised in a mechanized world in which we listened to music on wax, got direction by reading maps, wrote on paper and cursive in which form and style mattered, and told time with hands. Digital culture? Well, whereas primary relationships in analog culture included the nuclear family and select others with whom intimacies were formed, in digital culture, a relationship to a screen has been added. And in fact, this inhuman member is now the medium calibrating many other human relationships. It isn't just a play or obsession, as in gaming. It's everything. A vast, powerful source of information, access, and capacity for work in the economy. The medium and nexus for managing all relationships, in fact. It is difficult to think of something more influential or comprehensive than those screens, like the one you're looking at now. In analog culture, tools were the technology one used individually as necessary and then put down. Think typewriter, lathe, jackhammer, truck, tractor. The tools one used might form an important element of one's identity, but where one lived and who one lived with were also hugely important to shaping identity and a sense of reality. And by sense of reality, I mean I'm referring to meaning as the way we perceive and interpret the world around us. But in digital culture, there is a kind of invisible field of vision that defines reality. And our tools, smartphone, laptop, or tablet, virtual reality, HDMs, they keep us plugged into this otherwise invisible and silent electronic ecosystem. The pervasive loss of privacy that's become part of this digital world has also greatly diminished our sense of personal boundaries. And many people consider that a primary source of increased anxiety. Now, the other significant difference between analog and digital culture is the rate of change. While the world and its technology changed steadily from 1900 to 1980, the rate of change was supersonic beginning in the 1980s with the arrival of a World Wide Web and personal computers. The advent of social media and virtual reality put the speed of change on steroids. And now AI promises to eclipse anything else that we've known. Now, those of us raised in analog culture are reeling. Even though we may be facile with the use of digital technologies, we're still reeling because we grew up learning to trust what we could see and feel in the dirt of the ordinary all around us. And now, the digital reality we're plugged into competes for our trust. Who and what do we trust? Trust. Scientific culture has taught us that reality is defined by what can be measured and replicated in the laboratory. Trust that, it tells us, and don't trust the unproven. But digital culture sends us wave upon wave upon wave of differing truths, each one claiming to be real. AI is capable of delivering absolute falsehoods and ruthless propaganda dressed in completely believable disguises. What's true? Who do we believe? What or who is the source behind the source and behind that source? So, if you're like me, existential agnosticism has more than creeped in. And to be honest, I've always been an existentialist. So, knowing I don't know isn't that much of a stretch. In a quiet moment in which I feel centered and calm, I have no trouble entering into the zone of humility in which I know very little with certainty. God? Oddly, I have no trouble holding on to God. Not because I can measure or replicate the sacred within any present moment, but probably because I never needed proof of the holy to begin with. God is embedded in me, at my core, along with the dark and the evil elements of who I am. But unlike those denizens of my shadow, God transcends both shadow and ego, truly a power greater than the self. God is so much a part of my personal history, present with me in my body as long as I can remember, that even though I don't know if I know very much at all, I do know that God is present. I cannot give that knowing to anybody else, but like you, I can begin to dismantle the ideas and the assumptions that make knowing and trusting God so much more difficult. You see, because Christianity, as we hear it today and often see it practiced, simply erodes the credibility of our spiritual wisdom. We needed to nurture the health within us and within our embodied souls instead. We have inherited an ancient bipolar worldview in which there is good and there is evil. God is the one and the spiritual forces of darkness are the other. We are individually and or collectively allied with the one or the other, agents of good or evil, not both. But because human beings have always required a more permissive reality, since we can imagine perfection but never get there, we have always created a way out for ourselves. Confession, redemption, contrition, sacrifice, some ritual method of finding our way back to God's forgiveness and the good graces of the religious institutions as well. These have been central to religion and rooted in rejecting and denigrating pieces of our flesh and blood, our embodied soul, rather than healing any divorce within. From the outside looking in, Christianity is full of shocking, bizarre, and some humorously ridiculous means of earning our way back to moral okayness. We have no choice since we are either good or bad, aiming for heaven or headed for hell. We lust after a just and fair existence in which reward and punishment are meted out to fix the obvious injustices that scar the world we live in. But let's be real. On the Serengeti Plain, there are sun-roasted rib bones of gazelles and lions alike. And some elephants end up with short lives while some hyenas live long ones. Dung beetles have a niche all that they thrive in, right alongside pink flamingos strutting their stuff. When it works, it all works together to form a balanced ecosystem that includes microscopic bacteria and huge herds of wildebeest. Humans, we want to construct something different, but we start at the same place as the rest of creation. We are part of the ecosystem, not separate and unique from it. Enter Jesus. He brought us a prophetic vision of God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. In theological mythology, the gospel image of the reign or the kingdom of God on earth serves as a nice kind of bookend to its Genesis counterpart in the Garden of Eden. We begin with the Big Bang forming God's dream of a perfect world, and are promised it will end with the restoration of its perfection. Now that thematic symmetry makes sense, and we can understand why Christians went there as the movement evolved. But the lions do not need to lay down and cuddle with the lambs in order for creation to be splendid and to make sense. We need instead a healthy ecosystem that lives in balance. Evil, then, is not a satanic spiritual entity that inhabits us, nor death hectoring the embodied soul into hell. Rather, evil is that which fragments and decays or pulls apart the balanced interdependence within the ecosystems of creation. Those ecosystems are both the interior landscape of our embodied souls, as well as human societies and our relationships with the planet. Please hear this. The shadow is not evil because it exists, and it's there within us and among us. It produces evil because it fragments us. But that isn't a necessity. In condemning parts of ourselves to exile from the ego, all those disowned memories and characteristics and talents and capacities, we sow the seeds of fragmentation within ourselves. The shadow and the ego have a relationship that is inseparable and must be reconciled toward health rather than left to fester and decay. Almost anything and any part of ourselves can be good or bad or both and. What is its impact within and around us? How can we join the energies of our disowned parts with those of our trusted and appreciated parts? How can we work toward reconciliation and wholeness within ourselves rather than stern separation and angry rejection? I hate to sound like a broken record, but remember Jesus? So James Hillman, I think also remembered Jesus when he wrote that the care of the shadow is a problem of love. How far can our love extend to the broken and ruined parts of ourselves, he wrote, the disgusting and the perverse? How much charity and compassion have we for our own weakness and sickness? How far can we build an inner society on the principle of love? He continued to write, loving the shadow may begin with carrying it. Thus is a cure a paradox, requiring two incommensurables. The moral recognition of these parts of me are burdensome and intolerable and must change, and the loving, laughing acceptance which takes them just as they are, joyfully forever. We must both try hard and let go, both judge harshly and join gladly. So you see, the problem of the human shadow is not fixed by rejection, elimination, amputation, or abandonment. Confession, yes, because brutal self-honesty is required. But with confession comes recognition, the urge toward compassion and understanding, and then tough love that extends new opportunities so long as there can be growth and learning and better outcomes. You and I have some disowned parts of ourselves that need recovery and TLC, just to bring them into conversation with our conscious self. That won't happen if we live in fear and shame of them, rather than recognition and care. So I invite you to spend some time listening and watching for the telltale signs of your rejected parts, and to consider some new possibilities for nurturing them into conversation. Next time, death, God, and the borderland between Advent and Christmas. Until then, peace be with you.